Today we're going to be talking a little bit about inviting the stranger and inviting the other. And I don't think I need to say why. I think the times that we're living in are particularly challenging ones. Are times when we are kind of retrenching, or many of us are retrenching against the perceived onslaught of forces that we can't control. And that's manifesting in all sorts of ways in the various societies that we live in. And so it seemed like a good occasion for us to kind of take stock of that, become aware of what that means and that's meant to each of us in our lives. And with this first session, what I wanted to do is invite these 6 presenters to share with you a little bit about their perspective of having been a stranger, having been the other, having been treated as the other, and perhaps having treated others in the same way as people to be perhaps feared or suspicious of or wary of for a variety of reasons. And based on their experience, then I'm hoping with the second session later this afternoon that we can break out into groups and you can all speak about your own experiences of what that looks like as we seek to build common community.
Well, good afternoon. It's a joy to be with you here in Seattle and to be part of launching this series of community engagement with Spiritual Directors International. I think it couldn't be more timely and more appropriate. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about my experience of being a female in a role as a spiritual leader that is dominated by males. And you know, when Paramahansa Yogananda came to the US from India in 1920, he came in his Hindu robes and his turban, and he was subject to no small amount of prejudice and ridicule. And he said, God doesn't like it when we make fun of him when he's wearing his dark clothes, meaning his dark skin. And so I would like to say, also God does not like it when we make fun of her when she's wearing her flowered dress. So in our tradition, we see every person, that is our teaching tradition, to see every person as divine, to see every person as an expression of the One.
In Torah, which is the central text in Jewish tradition, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, also the first 5 books in what the larger community calls the Old Testament, the injunction to treat the stranger with justice, a justice that is equal to that with which the homeborn is to be treated, the injunction to love the stranger. Those injunctions are repeated at least 36 times. There's some Jewish scholars who think 46 times. That injunction is repeated more often than any injunction in Torah. It's even repeated more often than the injunction to love God, which is really telling. And the essence, of course, is that you need to treat the stranger with care, and you need to love the stranger because you know the heart of the stranger. You know the soul of the stranger. You've lived as strangers.
At the age of 32, I went to Africa. And there I encountered guns and war, and actually being the enemy. And it was in the mid-'80s, and I was traveling in Uganda. And frequently when I went into the country, the tension would rise somehow. And whenever we traveled rurally, we would encounter roadblocks. And a few times actually had a machine gun in my face, and I realized somehow now I've become the enemy, not just the stranger, but the enemy. And not always knowing what to do with that reality. And so it was very confusing for me. Again, the words kept coming back to me. I was supposed to love my enemy, and here we were, face to face. And so I did a lot of soul searching. At the same time, I found Africa to be incredibly hospitable. Even in the middle of the war, we would go to a small village and they would feed us their last food. And so it wasn't all of the country, it was just the soldiers were the ones in power, and they had a particular control. But the Africans themselves were incredibly hospitable.
When I trained in Japan, I was dressed up as a Buddhist monk and had been trained by my ordination teacher how to bow and how to say a few words in Japanese. Dozo yoroshiku onegai itashimasu, nihongo dekimasen. Some recognize that. I humbly beseech you. Please be kind. I really don't speak Japanese. But I said it well enough and I bowed well enough that they said, okay, he's acting like a monk, he looks like a monk. We're going to treat him like a monk. This was a great mistake. Anyway, eventually I was accepted, but I was also resented for being an American and a tall Caucasian, and even the Roshi, or the abbot of the temple, treated me something like a beloved puppy dog. Look, he can use chopsticks. Look, he knows how to bow. Look, he can speak a little Japanese. And he would drag me around to his appointments so that he could show off this big puppy dog.
For me, as a stranger, being an indigenous person, and having been born with a disability, our upbringing was very much of going into Indian boarding schools because it was mandatory for us in order to be acculturated. So we learned to, in an essence, not be accepted for who we were in our culture and our language and our traditional spiritual ways. And we had to be acculturated to learn the Western ways. And the Indian boarding schools were run predominantly by the Catholics and the Jesuits. So that is still part of my upbringing. There's parts that I accept, parts that I left behind. But you grew up with a sense of shame of who you were, and always a stranger, because no matter what, you were not going to be accepted by the Western society, even if you did the school, because of the skin of your color. Or because I had a disability, people would always assume, oh, you're also mentally retarded, and they would talk to me like I was, or acted that way.
The other one, which my parents thought was very important, is about how slavishly we are dependent on pundits and experts and authorities. We forget within us we have our inner teacher. The mullah is gravely ill. Wife is wailing. And now in comes the authority. The allopathic medical doctor who examines the mullah at length turns to the mullah's wife and says, oh, madam, as the Quran says, only Allah is immortal. Your husband is dead. His bosom has flown to the soul of God. But the mullah is not dead. He's feebly saying, I'm alive, I'm alive, I'm alive. What does the wife say? Quiet, don't argue with the doctor. The other aspect, of course, which is very important in inviting the stranger is the other. The Quran has some beautiful verses. It says, if Allah wanted, Allah could have made all of you one single community. But out of a divine design, God chose to create diversity so you might come to know the other on a human level, on a personal level. And this is one of the hardest things to do, suggests the Quran. There's another very beautiful tongue-in-cheek verse in the Quran which says, and God has created some of you to be a trial for others. But this is the work we're called upon to do today, again and again and again and again. And it's not about changing the other person's belief. It's about connecting on a human level.
What we're trying to do here is give you a number of different perspectives so that to encourage you to share your own during the second half of today's program. So I'm the son of an Indian man and a Spanish woman from Spain. I was born in Holland. I was raised in India, in England, in Belgium before coming to the States. I think the lesson that I've learned from all of this is the golden rule, which is treat others as you would have them treat you. Today, there's a stranger before you, and tomorrow you will be the stranger. And remember what it felt like to be a stranger yourself when you see others who don't belong to in your family or your group or your clique or your tribe or your nation or your linguistic group, your religious group, your faith tradition, and be accepting and welcome and recognize the common humanity between all of us, because we all take turns in this life playing various roles, and certainly particularly the role of the stranger is one that we have all experienced and that we will all likely experience in various ways again in our lives.